It's 12:35. I think we are good to go. Others will join in as we are moving. Um, my name is Ntabiseng Mashula. I am with South African Cities Network as a researcher. I will be facilitating this session today. Uh, our third webinar, Line Chats. So, colleagues, me to welcome you to this session. I I hope we're gonna have a uh, I'm just gonna now invite Fundong Kosi to come and set the scene for us and also just to give us a brief introduction of FCDO funding program for SA cities. But before Fundo comes in, I think it's important for me to just give a brief of what today's session is about. We will be looking at electrification of informal settlement financing model, and our we have Kim who will be taking us through showcasing a new tool that is co-designed by C40 Climate Action Implementation Program together with City of Johannesburg Energy Team. And the tool is meant to assess and plan the energy intervention in informal settlements. So this is what the session will be all about today. And please, Mfundo, come through and the scene for us and briefly introduce the funding program from FCDO. And you have 10 minutes to do that. Over to you, Mfundo.
Thank you very much, Ntabiseng, and good afternoon, colleagues. As Ntabiseng mentioned, my name is Mfundo Ngosi, and I am a program officer for UCAP and UK PET at the British High Commission. So I'm here actually just to give you a brief background of our UCAP program as well as our UK PET program, which does a lot of support for South African cities, with Johannesburg being one of them. So just quickly just share my screen, giving you a background of UCAP. Just please let me know if you can all see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. So yeah, as I mentioned, this is a quick UCAP. So UCAP stands for Urban Climate Action Program, and is a multilateral program funded by the UK's FCDO and Germany's Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. So UCAP supports cities in implementing actions through two main components. So that is the climate action implementation, which we call CAI, and the CET's finance facilities. So CAI is actually what C40 is leading on as Kodani. I have the pleasure of working with Kodani and Zarina as well. So the program is delivered through the partnership of C40 and GIZ. So the program strengthens local capacity, supports scalable climate solutions, and enhances urban resilience and sustainability. Because we at UCAPS believe that sustainable development goals without working cities is not possible. So which is why the emphasis is making sure that cities are climate resilient and are actually innovation hubs for climate change. So I'll just give a quick background of our cities finance facility. So this is a project preparation facility that supports cities to develop inclusive climate smart infrastructure and bring them to financial readiness. So this is done through the support of cities where a city advisor will be embedded. So we are currently have those embedded in Mbombela, city of Mbombela, city of Joburg, um, and Cape Town, as well as Drakenstein. So that is for the CFF support. So it is a technical and financial feasibility of prioritized projects and strengthening cities administration. So that's just a brief introduction of CFF, but we are not here for CFF. We are actually here for the work that Kai is doing. So Kai is provides technical support to cities for developing and implementing their climate action plans. So through Kai, cities have received expert guidance, capacity building, resources to turn climate strategies into real and impactful action. So Kai bridges a gap caused by limited technical capacity, lack of coordination across departments, and also the challenges accessing finance. So this Kai addresses these gaps by providing practical and tailored support to help the city deliver measurable climate actions and also promoting social inclusion and creating green jobs in that process as well. So that's just a brief uh, background of Kai. I am happy to actually chat with anyone who would like to know more of the program because I know I'm rushing through it. I'll just give my details at the end so that you can reach out to me just for me to give you maybe more specifics about the UCAP program. So now I'll just quickly take you through the background on UK Pact. So UK Pact is partnering for accelerated climate transition. And it is a flagship program under our ICF portfolio aimed at tackling climate change through funding, capacity building projects, and mobilizing expertise. So with UK Pact, it works in partnerships with your countries. So, for instance, the South African government that have high reduction potential and support them in implementing and increasing ambitions to tackle climate change. So, UK Pact is demand informed program. By that, I mean that we actually listen to the priorities of the South African government in terms of what aligns to their climate goals, and we support in realizing those goals as well. So our aim is so like I mentioned, the fund aims to align its support with the government. Um, so the government's existing plans and policies. So that's essentially what UK Pact does. So our mechanisms for UK Pact is so it's we give grant funding. So that is through a targeted call for proposal or open call for proposal or recently a direct award where an IP would be able to will come with the solution and we linking it to a government counterpart which will then endorse such activity and then will support that. So far, we've actually, for UK Pact, since its inception, we've worked on 23 projects. We've also worked on 9 expert deployments, which I'll explain shortly. We've partnered with 21 government entities, support through 13 implementing partners that we've worked across since its inception in 2020. So for expert deployments, we have two kind. That's a short-term deployment and a long-term deployment. So short-term is it ranges between 3 to 6 months, where individual or a small team of experts are bringing to deliver capacity building activities like training sessions, workshops, or making recommendations. So these experts can be from private sector, NGO, academia, and public sector. So the work is normally part-time, which is around 3 to 6 months. And then for long-term expert deployments, those are around between 12 months to 24 months in where an expert will be embedded into an institution to provide a full-time oversight of deliverables. So for that period. So, and then the individual could be hired for the role for its duration or could be in UK public sector employee as a secondment. So those in a nutshell is what the two programs are. I know I've rushed through it, but this is my email for anyone who'd like to get in contact with me, and then I'll just give them more specifics of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mfundo. Thank you. That was brief and straight to the point. Thank you so much. But I think, colleagues, you can hold those clarity-seeking questions. It was rushed, but it was clear. But maybe colleagues need some further information or quick questions. You can just drop them in the chat. Some you can just hold them, and then we'll just ask Fundo to give or elaborate more where you need clarity after our presentation from Kim. And with that said, colleagues, allow me to introduce our next presenter, who is Kim Walsh. I will just quickly read through her bio. So Kim Walsh is a director at Palmer Development Group, responsible for the public finance practice area. Kim has a master's degree in economics and undergraduate degree in economics and chemical engineering. She has 19 years of experience consulting to the public sector in South Africa. Kim's primary area of interest is financial analysis, modeling, which she applies across the range of fields, including public finance, water services, energy, urban systems, and environment. Kim also has a significant experience with municipal tariff settings. Her relevant recent project experience includes contributing inputs on financial and fiscal to the electricity distribution industry reform roadmap. Kim is also currently leading a team that is reviewing the local government fiscal framework for national treasury. Kim, we are so excited for you to take us through that tool and take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I think if I'd known you were going to read that all out, I might have sent a shorter bio. But thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm not sure that we have a bio for Jen, but the slide deck we're going to present, essentially we've got a few slides to go through, and then the bulk of my presentation today is actually not slides. We're going to jump into the tool that we developed for the study and demo that tool and look through it. But as intro to that, Jen van den Busche from Sticky Situations is just going to give a brief overview and background to the study to give some context for how and why the tool was developed. So Jen, over to you.
Cool bananas. Thank you, Kim. So this was a very exciting project we worked on with C40. We learned a great deal. So the presentation is just going to give a little bit of a background. It's a finance tool to help municipalities assess and plan for energy interventions and in informal settlements. Next slide. Thanks, Kim. So this presentation is going to give a demonstration of the tool, and it was designed by C40's Climate Action Implementation Program and the City of Johannesburg's Energy Team to help municipalities assess and plan for energy interventions in informal settlements. Next slide. The overall project objective was to develop a sustainable and reliable energy model to address energy access in informal settlements. The project had 4 phases. The first one was understanding the energy needs of an informal settlement, and View settlement just in Boysons, very close to the City Power head offices, was selected. The second part was reviewing a potential of installing PV panels on neighbouring factory rooftops for the same settlement at View. There was a case study of the 5 microgrids implemented by City Power in the last 2 years, and the development of a microgrid implementation tool, finance tool, which is this presentation. Next slide, please. So the View settlement was a deep dive into the energy needs of this particular settlement. At the time, there were around about 140 households. And what this case study looked at was at the household makeup, the household income, the energy use, the energy source, and the energy cost. And then, of course, looking at the overall energy challenges around that particular neighbourhood. The data was provided to a technical team to design an energy supply model. Next slide, please. The second phase was the neighbouring factory rooftops, was exploring the potential of placing the PV panels on nearby factory rooftops due to land shortage and accessibility. And factory owners were mostly positive, and technically the solution could have worked. However, the city legal technicalities put this particular aspect of this project on hold. Next slide, please. The microgrid case studies, there were 5, looking at those five microgrids I mentioned earlier, implemented by City Power in the last 2 years. Amarasta, Shalazili, Vlakfontein, Vukani, and View. This is just a picture to the right of the Shalazili microgrid. And the report focused on recommendations for South African municipalities and a lot of lessons learned. Next slide, please. And then, of course, what Kim will present is the microgrid financing tool to identify and design suitable funding models for financing sustainable alternative energy solutions. The financing tool uses net present value to compare the net cash flows of the 3 options over 20 years. And it looked at 3 options: full grid electrification, full solar micro PV based microgrid, and partial energy solution. Next slide, please. The study used the following areas to inform the tool: energy poverty and informal settlements, financial frameworks for sustainable energy, just energy transition principles and the just urban transition implications for informal settlements, institutional frameworks and local government roles, Johannesburg informal settlements upgrading programs, City Power's electrification and energy solutions. And then we looked at a number of alternative energy models currently being implemented, including iShack, Picobrick, Green Cape, Sonke Energy, City of Cape Town, and Amarasta. Thank you. Handing over to you, Kim.
Thanks, Jen. So I think the point here is that the development of this tool was part of a far broader study, and the tool was in fact a small component. So what I'm going to do now is just walk you through the kind of approach and logic behind the tool. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I'll flip over into Excel and we'll have a look at the tool itself. So what I didn't put up front was that the sort of original brief on the tool was to develop something that could support a business case for the use of alternative energy options in informal settlements. So we developed a tool that essentially projects the cash flows associated with these options and then converts them into a net present value so that we can compare those cash flows between different options for informal settlements and assess which might be viable. And there was a particular interest in assessing which of the technical options might be suitable for looking at private sector funding. So essentially what the tool does is it starts with some upfront capital costs for the options. So as Jen showed, the tool allows you to model 3 different technical options for an informal settlement for a particular settlement. And in order to do that, you need to know what is the upfront capital cost associated with each of those options and what asset replacement will be required. The tool looks at a 20-year period. So over that time, it will be necessary to renew or replace the assets. And those 2 capital costs are combined to work out the total capital expenditure required in each of the 20 years over the tool run. The user must then specify what funding sources are available. So will it be possible to use any government capital grants, so USDG specifically, or INEP outside of cities, to fund these interventions, and will there be any donor funding available? And the tool then takes the difference between the capital expenditure that must be incurred and the grant funding available, and assumes that the remaining funding gap must be covered through loans. So a loan will have to be taken up to cover the remaining capital expenditure required. A loan obviously has some cash flows associated with it. So there's an outflow in terms of the loan redemption over the life of the loan. There's an inflow right up front when the loan is drawn down. And then there are also finance costs over the term of the loan. The tool also looks at the other operating costs associated with each technology. So if the technologies do involve some purchase of electricity, which some do and some don't, there may be bulk purchase costs. There are ongoing operating costs for the infrastructure and ongoing maintenance costs. And together with the finance costs, these are the operating and maintenance costs considered in the tool. Then the tool looks at what inflows there are for the system. So what customer payments will be possible, and is it possible to use any operating subsidies to cover those operating costs? And so these are now converted into cash. So the cash outflows will be the capital expenditure, any loan redemption payments, all of those operating costs, and the cash inflows will be the loan drawdown right at the start, and any grants coming in and any customer payments received. The tool then puts those together to work out the net cash flow over the 20-year period and uses a discount rate to convert those into a net present value to be compared. So that's the overall overview and logic of the tool. I'm now going to stop sharing for a moment so that I can switch over into showing you the Excel tool itself. Okay, here we are. Just before I jump right into this, just to make it very clear that the scope of the project was to develop a relatively simple tool. There's lots of very complicated ways in which you can structure and blend finance for technologies like this. This tool essentially took a fairly simple approach on just looking at the net present value of cash flows to compare options. And also just to note that any of the data that is in here at the moment should be regarded as indicative and for demonstration purposes only. We weren't able to gather very detailed data in some cases. I will flag at appropriate moments what that actually means for considering energy options for informal settlement. So this is a relatively simple tool. You can see it's only 6 tabs. There's a cover page which provides some of the information I've just given on the overview of the tool. I'm going to go through this very quickly, and then it provides a lot of user information. So we tried to make the tool as user-friendly as possible. So there's a lot of information here on what the entries are required in every field. So everything that I'm going to go through today is written up on this cover and instructions sheet of the tool. There's then an input tab. The bulk of the inputs are made on this tab, and I'll go through this in detail. There's a dashboard where some of the key inputs are made and where the tool results are demonstrated. And then there are 3 calculation sheets. It's not expected that any user would need to interact with these, and they're all in fact locked, but these are where the underlying calculations for the tool are made. There's some color coding to try and make the tool more usable. Any blue cell requires an entry by the user, and these are generally specifications. So they're things that may be assumptions or things you may want to change and play within the tool. The gray cells are data required, and then any white cell is a formula or something drawn from elsewhere in the tool. So as indicated, the tool allows for 3 options to be modeled. So you can see here up front, there's a column for each of the options, and the 3 options demonstrated here are firstly electrification. Option 2 is the use of a microgrid plus gas for cooking. In the specification of the alternatives considered here, gas was included for cooking because it's often difficult to size microgrids so that they can fully allow for cooking as well, and gas provides a flexible addition to allow for cooking. And then the third option is what we called an iShack equivalent. So iShack provides a small solar panel on the roof of each dwelling, and the panel is really enough to provide for some lighting and a little bit of cell phone charging and that type of thing. And then that also includes gas for cooking. So this option 3 is a sort of a temporary solution while a more expanded solution is provided. The first thing required in terms of data is the size of the settlement that you're working with. A lot of the data entries are specified as per household. So the size of the settlement must be entered. This is in fact entered on the dashboard. So some of the key entries, as I mentioned, are made on the dashboard. So it's entered on the dashboard over here and pulled through to the inputs sheet. You then need to provide some information on capital costs and how those will change over time. So as I mentioned, these are per household. So what is the upfront capital cost associated with each of these technologies, and how are those costs expected to escalate over time? As I mentioned, this model is largely indicative, so you'll see that almost all of the expenditures and revenues or funding we've just escalated at 6%, a rough inflation rate, aside from electricity bulk purchases, which I'll speak to later. The tool allows you to include gas, to sort of switch gas on and off for any option. So this is just a drop down. You can select yes or no there, and you can see for this specification, gas was included for the two alternative energy options, but not for electrification. And if you do choose gas for cooking, then you need to indicate the upfront cost of the gas bottles and any infrastructure associated with it. And again, how those costs will rise over time. So this is about the initial capital costs. You then need to provide some information on asset replacement. What is the expected life of the infrastructure you're installing? So in other words, will that need to be replaced over the 20-year tool projection period? And similarly, if you're including gas for gas. So you can see here we've assumed a 20-year life, which means, in fact, within the 20-year model run, the infrastructure doesn't need to be replaced, but the gas bottles will be replaced every 5 years. We then, if you recall, we now look at how that capital expenditure will be financed. So the first possible source is capital grants. Again, you can see these are white here. They're not entered here. They are, in fact, entered on the dashboard. And essentially what we've assumed here is that the electrification option, which was 35,000 Rand per household, is fully funded out of grants, and that an equivalent amount of grant funding can be made available for the other options. This does depend, and to some extent it's about how cities choose to apply their grants. Some of the grants have conditions, but my understanding is that most of the grants can be used for alternative energy options in informal settlements. You then enter what will happen with those capital grants over time. As I mentioned, we assume the same escalation rate for everything. And then you can provide some information on whether you can use those capital grants for the gas and whether you can use them for asset replacement. And again, here we've just said yes for everything, but this can be toggled on or off in the tool. So what the tool now knows is it can project the capital expenditures that are incurred. It knows how much South African government grants are coming in, and it deducts those from the capital expenditure to work out a gap. And the user can specify how much of that gap might be filled with donor funding. Again, this is entered on the dashboard, which we'll go to in a minute. In this case, we assume there'd be no donor funding coming in. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the tool will deduct any donor funding and say, right, any other funding gap on the capital side must be filled by loans, and the user needs to provide some terms for those loans. So what will be the years of the loan, and what will be the average interest rate incurred? So once these entries are made, the tool is now able to project capital expenditures, capital financing coming in, and all of the cash flows associated with the capital side. Next, we specify information on operating expenditures and revenues. So firstly, bulk purchase costs. Essentially, through entering something in this kilowatt of electricity consumed, you are determining whether the option you're modeling is going to include some electricity or not. In this case, the electrification option obviously includes electricity. It's been assumed that neither of the other options will have any electricity use associated with them. I know that some cities and in some settlements kind of blended options are being assessed, so you may want to have some electricity and some alternative. Here, there's been assumption that every household will use 200 kilowatt hours of electricity a month. And you need to specify technical losses so that we know what bulk purchases will be required associated with that level of consumption. There are then cells to allow the user to specify what the cost of those bulk purchases will be. You can specify these both as a fixed cost per household and as a variable cost per kilowatt hour. In this case, we chose to enter just a variable cost of 2.02 Rand per kilowatt hour. And then here's an important entry. If you are using electricity, how is that bulk purchase price going to increase over time? As I mentioned in this specification of the tool, we assumed 6% growth in most expenditures and revenues, but for the bulk purchase costs, we assumed an increase of 9.7% per annum over the 20 years. Essentially, this was based on assuming very large increases in the first few years, and with that settling towards 6% over time. Knowing what's going to happen with the Eskom bulk purchase price is obviously very, very uncertain. And just as you can see here, if you don't specify anything as electricity consumed, then you don't need to enter anything else on the bulk purchases, because the tool will say, well, there's no bulk purchases and I don't need to project that. Moving on to the other operating costs, as I mentioned, these are separated between operations and maintenance. So operating costs are all the ongoing costs of running the infrastructure, and these are specified in rands per household per month. Generally, you have a good handle on what it costs to run your electrification service. This was one of the areas where we came up against data constraints, and I think it's worth being aware of, these new technologies that we're looking at, microgrids or mini grids, and to some extent the iShack alternatives. We don't always have good data and a good handle on what the ongoing operating costs will be. So here we had to use whatever we could find available. And again, you need to enter how those are going to grow over time. The operating cost for gas is essentially refilling the gas bottles every month, and again, how that will grow over time. Maintenance costs in the tool are specified as a percentage of the initial cost of the infrastructure. This is fairly standard for maintenance guidelines. There are some asset management guidelines from COGTA that can be used to estimate the maintenance needs for electrification. We use 2% here. Again, knowing what the maintenance needs for the alternative energy options, there's not great data. We found a piece of literature that we drew on for this specification for the demo. And then how will these maintenance needs grow over time? You also will enter the maintenance costs for the gas. We assume no maintenance. Essentially, you're just replacing your gas bottles every 5 years and filling them every month. So that's all of the operating costs. Now moving on to the operating revenues. Firstly, there are customer payments. If you are allowing for electricity, you can specify that some of that electricity will be provided free. Here we assume that of the 200 kilowatt hours used by the customer every month, 100 are provided free. And we can also specify non-technical losses. So in other words, of the electricity being used, what share are people actually going to pay for? And you can see here we've assumed quite a high degree of non-technical losses. And then you can specify what people will pay. And this is done on the dashboard. I'll speak to it in a minute. It's a really key factor for the viability of many of these options. And you can also specify how much subsidy you will be able to put towards it. And I'll speak to all of these things when we get over to the dashboard. So that's all of the entry sheets. The one thing I didn't mention is all of these cells to the right are just for your own notes. So most of these, anything next to a gray or a blue cell is a free entry, and it's just for you to write, okay, this is where I got this data from. This is what assumption I've made here in this case. So if we now flip over to the dashboard, as I mentioned, some of the key entries for the tool are in fact made on the dashboard. And the entries we chose to put on the dashboard are the ones that are really critical to the viability of these systems and which you may want to play with in specifying the tool. So on the dashboard, you specify how much capital grant funding you're going to be able to put into the system. I've mentioned that already. You mentioned whether there'll be any donor funding, and the dashboard then gives you an indication of how much loan funding is required over the 20-year projection. On the operating side, the dashboard shows you the average operating cost over the 19 years. This is on an average annual basis. And then also what you're paying in interest for those loans. And what you can see here is that the interest payments on the loan for the microgrid are very substantial. And then it is here that you enter what operating subsidy you will make available and what customer payments you can receive. For this demo, we assumed 136 Rand per household per month coming out of the equitable share to fund each of these options. And that 136 Rand is the amount that is made available, the equitable share formula for electricity. Obviously, the way in which equitable share is used is very different from city to city. And these are policy decisions around what operating subsidy will be allowed. And then an assumption around what fixed payments. And the results of the tool are really sensitive to this. So again, you would need some sort of sense of willingness to pay. We assumed a 300 Rand a month payment for the microgrid and the gas, and a 300 Rand payment for the iShack equivalent. That's quite high, but iShack is managing to get 150 Rand a month for their panels, and that's without cooking. So we assume that if the gas was provided, there may be some more willingness to pay for that. And for the electrification, we just assumed the first block of the electricity tariff. So just a payment per kilowatt hour used. So that will then give you a sense of what revenues you can generate. And after that, you can get a sense of what the overall funding gap is on these technologies. And then down here below, one of the key outputs is what is the net present value of all of the cash flows. Before I comment about that, lower down on the tool are some tables that show you the full projection of all of the cash flows. So you can see the cash payments that are being made for the capital expenditure, the loan redemption, operating expenditures and input. And you can see the cash that's coming in from the capital grants, any donor funding, the loan drawdown, operating subsidies and customer payments. So the difference between the total payments and the receipts gives you the net cash flow. And then those are converted into a net present value basis. I think I actually skimmed over that. But up at the top here, you enter a discount rate to be used for those calculations. For the purposes of this analysis, we just assumed inflation as our discount rate. But in some cases, you may want to use a discount rate above inflation to allow for a return on investment in the project. And essentially what the net present value does is it discounts all those cash flows down to current and adds them all up so that you can compare between different alternatives. Some alternatives may have high capital costs, but low operating costs. That's typically the case for alternative energies. Some have lower capital costs, but high operating costs. That's often the case for electrification. And net present value allows us to discount those all back to the current point in time so that we can compare them on an equivalent basis. And again, just remember these models are completely indicative. As I said, in some of the cases, the data, we just made estimates. But what's shown here is that the net present value for electrification is the worst of the three. But the microgrid does have a negative net present value, which means the total cash outflow is greater than the inflows. The only one that's currently showing here as a positive net present value, quite small, is iShack. And just remember that's very strongly based on the assumptions that have been made in the tool. Before I go and unpack a little bit about why those results are, just to show you again, on the dashboard, there are some graphs here that show the capital finance mix and when the capital expenditures are incurred. You can see for electrification, it's all upfront because the infrastructure has a 20-year life, so it's not replaced over the course of the tool. For the microgrid, it's funded upfront through a mix of grants and loan funding. And then you can see there is some capital expenditure every 5 years for the replacement of the gas bottles. For iShack, it can be fully grant funded, and there's capital expenditure every 5 years for the replacement of the gas bottles. These blue bars here on the iShack are in fact the same as for the microgrid. Just note the different scales here. So the magnitude of expenditures for the microgrid dramatically larger than that for the iShack equivalent. I'm almost done because I certainly need a break. But the final graph here is in the top corner is the net cash flows of the project. So that's essentially the cash flows that are projected in these tables down here, just shown in a graphical form. And this gives us a really nice picture of what we're looking at with these types of options. So for electrification, we can see the net cash flow just getting worse and worse over time. Essentially, the payments that are received for the electricity purchased in these informal settlements isn't sufficient to cover the costs of providing electricity. So there's a net outflow of cash every year, and that gets larger and larger over time, partly due to inflation. These are nominal rands, but in this case also because bulk purchase costs are rising more rapidly than the payment. So the funding gap is increasing over time. So the kind of net cash flow picture on the electrification is just looking worse and worse. For the microgrid, what you can see is that for the first 15 years, there's a negative There's an outflow of cash. So this gray line here is in the negative territory. That's while the loan is being paid off. So the capital grants are not enough to cover the fairly high upfront capital costs of this technology. And so there must be a loan. And the interest payments and the redemption on that loan mean there's a negative cash flow until the 15 years and the loan is fully paid off. And from that point onward, the assumption of a 300 Rand payment is enough to cover the costs of running that grid. And so the cash flows become neutral. So essentially what this tells us is that if we can find a way to fund the upfront capital costs of this technology, then if we can get a 300 Rand payment per household per month, we can manage to cover the costs of that. The only one that shows a positive net cash flow out of through the whole time is iShack. Again, that's based on, it's got very little upfront capital cost. The operating costs are really moderate. And so a 300 Rand payment is in fact more than enough to cover those ongoing operating costs. So the big question on something like an iShack is how much are people actually willing to pay for that type of service? And that is essentially it. I think I definitely need to pause and we can take some questions. And I think I'll just stop sharing for a minute so that I can see everybody while we take those questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Kim and Jean. That was lovely. Colleagues, and you are right on time. Colleagues, it's time to engage Jennifer and Kim on the tool. Comments are welcome. Inputs. How do you see these working? How do you see yourself using this tool? And please, colleagues, you can just raise your hands. I will just take the first set of questions so that we engage Kim and Jennifer. If you can just raise your hands, I'll be able to recognize you. I'm trying to look for hands, but okay. Any questions, comments? Welcome. I see Olga. Olga will be the first. Can I get at least 3 so that we engage Zukiswa? You are noted. If I can just get the third one so that we engage Kim and Jennifer on the first set, and then we'll come for the next set of questions. Okay, Olga, I don't see any other hand. Olga, you can go first, and then because we don't really have a lot of hands, maybe Kim and Jennifer, you can first engage Olga's question, then we'll come to Zukiswa. Thank you. You can go on.
There's a question in the chat as well, which we can also address.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the presenters for the lovely comprehensive presentation. I think I'll need more time to engage it more thoroughly because I found it extremely interesting, and it correlates with some of the study that we had undertaken. So maybe to introduce myself, I'm Olga Koma, and I'm in the Western Cape's Department of Infrastructure in Policy and Research. I just want to ask on the informal settlements, what type of informal settlements were you looking at in terms of land ownership? Is it informal settlements that have located on government-owned land versus private land? And then if it's on private land, how do you deal with the challenges there? And then my other question had to do with iShack. I remember reading a study on iShack that actually most of the participants had found that their payment structure was a bit unaffordable, and in actuality, they could only afford around 80 Rand. And then maybe if you can speak more about the model that iShack employs, because I think 300 Rand is a bit steep, considering if we're talking about informal settlement and the average income for those communities are around 3,500. Thank you. I think I'll keep it there.
Kim, do you want me to allow Zukiswa, or you want to tackle them one by one? Or what do you suggest? How best do you think you'll be able to respond? We do have time to engage speakers, so I don't want to rush your engagement with them also. So I wanted to check with you. Do I take all the questions, or you will engage them each as
I think let's respond one by one, given that we don't have a huge number of questions, and maybe it'll warm up and we'll need to start taking them in groups. Jen, can I ask you to address the first question on the type of informal settlements?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. The type of settlements didn't come into the financing tool at this point. The complications of land ownership, because the financing tool is meant to be something that is an overview that provides a guiding figures. The land ownership the land ownership really only came in when we were looking at the different types of funding models of what the energy could be financed by. So the tool is not affected by land ownership at this point. And then anything else to add to that, Kim?
No, just that I think you're right. It doesn't come into the tool, but it may obviously affect what technologies are appropriate. I mean, I know there are issues with cities investing in infrastructure on private land, some of which I think can be, there are ways to get around it, but it does increase the complexity if the city doesn't own the land that the settlement's on. Yeah.
Yep, agreed.
And then maybe on the ISHAC question, my understanding, Olga, and I'm not a complete expert on it, but is that it's quite variable. There have been settlements where people, there has been quite a good willingness to pay. People are really happy with the service. I think it's operated quite effectively. Just to note, the 300 Rand we assumed here, my understanding is the payment for ISHAC is 150 Rand or less. We added an additional payment for gas on top of that because the ISHAC doesn't include a gas option. But it's always the issue with this. My understanding is that communities very much regard ISHAC as a temporary option. They're happy to have that rather than to have nothing, and they're happy to pay something for it. Generally, though, they want a more expanded energy option to be provided. And again, I'm going slightly beyond my boundaries here, but some of the issues with the alternative technologies is what can they be used for, and to what extent can they be used for the full range of energy services, and to what extent are they limited? Just on so affordability and willingness to pay for all of these options is going to be a major issue. It's already an issue with electricity. I believe that City of Cape Town recently did some work where they found that people were often paying 300 Rand a month for an illegal electricity connection. So there is willingness to pay. The question is, what service are you getting in exchange for that? And is there willingness to pay for all of these options? But it's a key factor in determining how viable the options are. The only reason that the ISHAC has that positive cash flow in the projections I showed you is because of that 300 Rand a month payment. And if the payment was lower, then obviously the kind of financial viability would change.
Agreed. And do you mind if I just add on to that around ISHAC? I mean, the things that we grappled with was, in terms of this model, was what are we trying to show? What is useful to show? Full grid electrification is one thing. A microgrid type solution is not going to give a full energy supply to certain households of certain sizes. And then we wanted to try and see different alternatives. We could not compare apples with apples, but we wanted to see these are the ideas that are available. And to be perfectly honest, ISHAC were one of the very few South African solutions that we could find enough financial data on to know exactly how much it cost the householder up front. And the rest of Kim's comments apply. Thanks.
Thanks, Tabi Singh. Was there another question? And then there are some coming through written in the chat.
Yes, Olga. Olga, are you fine? Are you sorted? Do you still want to engage the speakers more?
Yes, Chair, I'm sorted. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll move just before we go to the questions on the chat. I'll move on to Zukiswa. Please come through with the questions, comments, and inputs.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Kim, for the presentation. Also for the presentations that have been made to the meeting. Thank you so much. The tool, from my observation, is quite intense. There is a lot of information that is required, and I'm just wondering, from my side, how would the metros first get access to the template? How also the grant, is it a performance incentive grant? Is it how is the grant? What are the conditions of the grant, and when maybe are we to prepare ourselves for such when it comes to be custodied to the metros? Also, I think one of the questions that I was going to raise is one that is raised on the chats in terms of training and accessing the information that is required pertaining to the template itself, because there's a lot of information that is there that will be required from metros. Thank you, Chair.
I think I'll leave it to Jen or possibly Kordani around accessing the tool. Zukiswa, it's always interesting. So compared to a lot of the tools that could be developed, this is actually relatively simple. And you'll see that when I address some of Jeremy's comments further down the line. I'm not sure what you're referring to, the conditions of the grant. So there's not a particular grant associated with this, unless you're talking about what the sort of programs that Mfundo was talking about in the beginning, which are entirely separate from this tool. So this tool is not linked to any grant. The grants that I'm talking about in the tool are grants that you already have access for and can choose to apply for the provision of alternative alternative energy and informal settlement. So the USDG and the equitable share, for example, which are the two grants available to you as a city. So yeah, if the question on the conditions of grants and things was about the broader work that Mfundo was presenting, then that's not linked to this tool. And then on training, my understanding is that there's not particular training being offered on this. But again, I'll defer to Jen and Kordani on the availability of the tool. As I mentioned, there are very, very detailed user notes on the first tab. They take you through, where you must make entries, how you make entries, what sort of data you require. So there is user stuff available in the tool. Kordani, I don't know, do you want to respond on the availability of the tool?
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for the question. So we are making the tool available on request. So if you would like to receive the tool and the template, we are happy to send you the file. So I'll drop my email on the chat, but also if you write to SACAN through Sean, they can also help facilitate sharing of that tool. So we're not going to share it on a public platform, but if you request it, we will share it to those municipalities that are interested. Thanks, Kim.
If I can also respond to, in terms of the training of the tool, I also found, I'm not as clever as Kim when it comes to these things, but I was able to figure out how to use it, and she showed me quite briefly. So if anybody does get the tool and needs a quick rundown on how to plug the entry in, you're welcome to email us, and one of us will jump online and help you with pleasure. I also found it fairly, once I got my head around it, it was quite easy to use, and I really liked the way that the grant, it's not linked to a specific grant, but you could play with the figures to see what grant you could apply to the finance to make things work in the municipality's favour as well.
Thanks, Jen. Tabi Singh, maybe if we just look at the questions in the chat. So firstly, there were two questions from Jeremy. Is the model discounting salvage value at year 20 or assuming full write-off? And secondly, for the microgrid plus cooking, how does fuel price volatility affect internal rate of return and payback in the hybrid option? So just on Jen's point about not being as clever as me, this is never about cleverness. It's about familiarity with these kinds of financial tools and projections. And Jeremy, from your question, I'm guessing you are fairly familiar with these. And what the questions that Jeremy is alluding to demonstrate the fact that this is quite a simple tool. And Jeremy, what the brief to us is to develop a tool that had fairly simple data entries and was quite easily accessible. That does mean that there's a lot of nuance about what could go on with these types of projections that are not fully accommodated in this tool. And if you have the capability and the knowledge, then it's worth doing some more complex projections. So the short answer is the model discounting salvage value at year 20? No, it's essentially assuming that the full value of the infrastructure must be replaced, and that there's no kind of salvageable value remaining. And then how does fuel price volatility affect internal rate of return? Again, you can develop tools like these where you enter what these prices will be in each year, or you enter growth rates that change over time. We chose not to do that here to keep the tool simple. So it takes one rate of increase. So it doesn't really accommodate fuel price volatility. It will say the cost of that gas will increase at 6% per annum. So this tool won't really be able to assess the impact of volatility, although you could certainly test different average rates of growth, which would show you the fact that obviously if your fuel price grows more rapidly, the viability of the option, but you need higher customer payments or more subsidy to cover that. So this tool can't handle like something like a spike in price in 1 year. It's just looking at average growth rates over time. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to respond verbally or if that accommodates your questions. Jeremy, do you want to come in, or shall we go on to the questions from Kevin?
You really answered my question, and I understand where you're coming from. The methodology was just to make a very simple model. The nuances are not accommodated in there right now. I think that answers the question.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, and I think what a model like this does is it demonstrates some of the issues that we see when we're comparing electrification and alternative energies, which is a lot of the issues around trade-offs of capital costs versus operating costs. So you're often comparing, in fact, electrification, once you've got your bulk infrastructure in place, the capital costs of that are lower than of alternative energies, but you're having higher ongoing operating costs. And so a tool like this can demonstrate those trade-offs. What I found interesting in developing the tool, and it's been touched on in some of the questions, is it also flagged what kind of data you need when you're thinking about this. And often we have really good data on the capital costs because we know what it's going to cost to put this microgrid in place or to put this thing in place. But there's often not really good data or not a good handle on what is it going to cost to run it over time. And sometimes it's actually difficult to get data on what's it costing to run, the electricity in an informal settlement. So in order to make really informed financial decisions on trading these things off, you do need to have a fairly good handle on those operating costs so that you can compare them. Also, maybe just to make the point, obviously, a financial case is not the only reason to be considering alternative energy options. And the broader study, this financial tool, again, was a small part of a broader study making a case for alternative energy that doesn't only include whether it financially makes better sense or not. Obviously, there are really positive benefits in terms of using clean energy and environmental benefits. There can also be other benefits to alternative energy that are not purely financial. I think I'm just waffling now. There's also a question from Kevin in the chat. How could cities be trained on the use of this tool, and which departments need to be part of the training? How did you address the challenge with data access? Would your recommendations be for municipalities? What would your recommendations be for municipalities to improve their data structures? I think the question on training has been answered. There's not formal training going to be provided, but the tool can be made available, and it has, I think, fairly good user notes in it. Which departments need to be part of the training? It's not an easy question to answer because in my experience of working with cities, they're all set up fairly differently. But I suppose this would be departments that are looking at options for providing energy in informal settlements. And often that actually sits across an interface between electricity and sometimes your financial department. So it's one of the difficult things in introducing projects like that, and very dependent on your particular organizational setup, I would imagine. How did you address the challenges with data access? So in this case, and this is always the case within the timeframes of the project, we had to make use of what data was available. And then as I've mentioned, in some cases, we just had to use assumptions to fill the gaps. Data is always an issue. The data that's required by this tool is actually relatively straightforward. a lot of this, and your comment on data structure, that's I'm afraid a little bit outside of my scope, is how should cities improve their data structures. But I would think that at the very least you need to have, particularly if you're looking at alternatives, you need to have a good handle on what is it currently costing you to supply electricity in informal settlements, and hopefully some of your cost to supply studies are giving you insight in that. And then obviously you need to have a fairly good handle on the costs of any new technology that you're introducing. So the most difficult data to put into this tool is the cost data. Generally, you will have a fairly good sense of what the current levels of electricity consumption and payment and so forth in those settlements are. Kevin, I don't know if you had any follow-ons or if that's adequately addressed your question there.
That's thanks so much for the insights. I think those are really insightful answers. I think my first question was, if this tool had to be trained to cities, how long, how would that training look like? Would it be a half-day training, a full-day training? Just trying to understand like how deep it is, and how much time cities would need to kind of ingest this information.
So Kevin, I work with really complex tools. So I think this is like a 2-hour training. It's a fairly straightforward tool. I think I like the way Jen put it. Once you properly get to grips with the logic and think through what it's doing, then actually making entries and using the tool is not difficult. So I think you're talking about a kind of a 2-hour session. To tell you the truth, if you properly want to embed training, what I found you really need to do kind of action learning. So you do a 2-hour session, then you take the tool, you try play with it, you try do some stuff, and then you maybe have another 2-hour session to ask the questions that come up through that process. My experience on providing training on tools in the past is training's completely useless if people aren't actively using the tool, because it's only when you actively use it that you really come up against the difficult bits and get stuck. So yeah, if I was designing a training on this tool, I would say a 2-hour session and then another 2-hour session in a month once people had actually applied the tool. But it's once you get to grips with it, it's not all that complicated. The entries are fairly simple. As with all of these things, it's getting the data that sometimes takes a bit of time.
Thank you, Kim.
Right. I think from the chat, Kim, we have exhausted those questions. Colleagues, any other questions? We still have time if you want to engage the speakers. We also had Fundo was talking about some funding programs. If you also had a question for him, you are still welcome to bring them. I don't see any more hands. So yeah, it looks like we've exhausted our questions. I don't know if Kim and Jennifer, you have any final remarks about the tool, and yeah, then I'll just close the session after your closing remarks about the tool and any recommendations whatsoever.
I mean, maybe my closing comment would be, and as I've said, these tools are very much indicative. The data could be further refined. But the big thing that stood out for me is that when we're looking at alternative energy, we're talking about a trade-off of capital expenditure and operating expenditure. And the big question is how to fund the upfront capital costs of these systems. Over time, their operating costs are often a lot lower. So if you can get over the capital funding barrier, then from an operating perspective, alternative energy systems are generally way more affordable and easier to operate down the line. So I think that was my big takeout. Jen.
Awesome. Jen?
So my big takeout, I think, was what I really enjoyed is, once I agree with Kim on the training, was pulling, once we did for more details on the case study, for example, of the 5 microgrids in Joburg, I then started looking at where the funding came from, where the private sector like CFF could come in, and not the private sector, but other organisations come in, assist with the funding. And then I plugged it in and played with it. And I think I agree with Kim that this hands-on practically coming to a training session with some information that can be manipulated could be really, really useful, this sort of action research type training. I found it really useful to try and plug in private funding, public sector funding, and and understanding where it could be applied in that tool across, and it helped me to understand where additional funding could be sourced to bring the cost down. That was just my lesson in and my post thought afterwards, because I'm thinking about what somebody said earlier about what people can afford. Every single settlement is so different. Like, I do think the tool needs to be applied on a settlement by settlement basis, because if you look at View versus Amarasta versus Shalazili and Vlakfontein, you look at every settlement has completely different requirements, completely different income levels, and different energy needs. And I think it sort of needs to come down to that sort of level to be it can be applied blanketly across the city if you had a series of averages, but it really needs to be settlement by settlement. That's just my thought.
Oh, well, awesome. Thank you. I really enjoyed this session. Taking us through that tool, that was quite interesting. And I would like to thank colleagues who also engaged the speakers, and I believe even those who didn't engage the speakers, they must agree with me that it was quite interesting, eh? So colleagues, if you want this tool, you can just request it from, I think Kodani dropped her email address. Just write to her. And for those who would love to be trained, I'm sure they can reach out through Kodani also to be trained on the tool. I think it's quite interesting. And with all that said, I would like to thank everyone. Fundo, thank you. Kim, thank you. Jennifer, thank you so much. And colleagues, thank you for making this time. I think we have like about 19 minutes of our time that we regained from this session, which is lovely. It was nice. And this was a very interesting session. And I would love to close it and say thank you to everyone. Have your lovely day ahead. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.